What's going on, ladies, gents, and kids of all ages? It is Eric coming back at you once again from the Nerd Cave, and today we have another very exciting deck tech for you. There was a couple decks that we talked about before the set was even fully released, fully announced even, and those decks were Amber Emerald and Amber Sapphire. Earlier this week we talked about Amber Sapphire, and you guys loved it. I think those decks were really highly supported. They're kind of off-meta decks, but they're both still really good, and this week we're going to be talking about Amber Emerald, which I'm very excited about. Before we get into that, as always, a big shout out to the Patrons for making the giveaways on the channel possible. Couldn't do it without you guys. And if you're one of the people who entered the Christmas giveaway, definitely go check out the last video, because we did announce that Christmas giveaway winner and it hasn't been claimed yet. If that's not claimed by the time we're getting ready to do next video, we will be choosing a different winner. So go check out that video if you missed it. If you're somebody who has tuned into the channel for a while, there's a chance you may have entered it and didn't even realize that you won. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and talk about Amber Emerald aggro. That went a little more mid-rangey, went pretty aggro with my early game cards and a little kind of mid-rangey as you get beyond that, which I think is a good way to balance things out. But the first card we're playing in the 1-drop slot is going to be Fred, Mascot by Day, a 1-cost inkable 1/1 questing for 1. But when this character is challenged, you're going to go ahead and gain 2 lore, so he's going to be potentially gaining you 3 a lot of the time. A lot of people said this card should have Ward. I feel like having Ward at a 1-drop might have made it extra broken. I think that would be awesome, but I don't think anybody wants to get into another Bucky situation. So I think as he stands, he's good. Honestly, if my opponent uses removal on him, great. If not, then I'm going to be able to go ahead and take advantage of him for multiple quests, or they'll challenge into him. He won't deal a lot of damage back, but I will get that 2 lore pretty early in the game, hopefully. Next up, also in the 1-cost slot, we're on 4 Cursed Merfolk, Ursula's Handiwork, a 1-cost uninkable 0/1 questing for 2. Whenever this character is challenged, which is probably only going to happen once, given that he's a 0/1, unless you get him in something like Hidden Cove. But even still, why would your opponent challenge him twice? That would be kind of silly on their part. Every time he's challenged, your opponent's going to be discarding a card, which is just fantastic for you. Any quest for 2. 1 cost, the quest for 2 are great. Next up in the 1-cost slot, we do have 2 Clarabelle Clumsy Guest, a 1-cost inkable 1/2 questing for 1. With the ability Butterfingers, when you play her, you may pay 2 additional ink to go ahead and banish chosen item, which is great into those item heavy matchups. She is also a potential shift target for the big Clarabelle later in the game. Next up in the 1-cost slot, we are on 4 Daisy Duck Donald's Date, a 1-cost uninkable 1/4 questing for 2, with the ability that every time she quests, your opponents are going to reveal the top card of their deck. If it is a character card, they may put it into their hand, probably never going to choose not to. And if it's not a character card, they have to go ahead and ship it to the bottom of their deck. Great way into those Sapphire matchups to get rid of those Fishbone Quills and Be Prepared. Those decks tend to have a lot of non-character cards, so Daisy can put in a ton of work, particularly in the early game. Then last up in the 1-cost slot, another shift target, we do have 2 Kita Atlantean, a 1-cost inkable 2/2 questing for 1. That's all she's doing, and she is here as a shift target, like I mentioned. Then jumping over to the 2-cost slot, we are on 3 Ursula Deceiver, a 2-cost inkable 1/3 stat line questing for 1. With when you play this character, chosen opponent reveals their hand, you can choose a song card from it, and they're going to discard that card. Fantastic in the early game to deal with some of those early game spells that may be removing some of those characters without your opponent having to challenge it, like Fred and Cursed Merfolk. Or it's really good going into turn 4 or turn 6, depending on the matchup, to deal with things like Grab Your Swords and Be Prepared. Next up in the 2-cost slot, we're on 2 Go-Go Tamago, a card that has really been quite favored in the current meta. He is a 2-cost inkable 2/2 stat line questing for 1. He is evasive, does die to Genie, which is a little bit of a bummer, but really what you're using him for is to get his ability going when he first comes into play, and that's when you play this character. You may pay 2 an additional ink to gain lore equal to the damage on chosen opposing character. So if you have an opposing character with a little bit of damage on it, you can go ahead and gain a little bit of lore. Great way to close out games. Last character in the 2-drop slot, one that's fallen out of favor a little bit, but I think when you have other things for your opponent to use their direct removal on, this card can kind of sneak through after the fact. People aren't necessarily expecting you to play it in the current meta, and that is going to be Flynn Rider, Charming Rogue, a 2-cost inkable 1/2 stat line questing for 2. Whenever this character is challenged, the challenging player is going to choose and discard a card, same as Cursed Merfolk. So if they're using that direct removal on your Cursed Merfolk, and then you're like, bam, haha, Flynn Rider also, they're going to be kind of bummed. This deck does have a secondary discard focus, so it can go kind of aggro, go discard, go into the long game with those late game Kitas. You'll see some of those late game cards that we're going to use to kind of keep up with what our opponent is doing as the game continues if we aren't able to aggro them out right at the beginning. But one of the two cost actions we're using in the deck, we are playing 4 Sudden Chill, a 2-cost inkable action song. So those 2-cost characters, 3-cost characters, and so on can go ahead and sing it. Each opponent chooses and discards a card, which is fantastic, especially if you can sing it, because then it's not going to be costing you any ink. Great option to sing with Ursula. Also a great option to sing with Ursula, we are on 3 The Bare Necessities, a 2-cost inkable action song. Chosen opponent reveals their hand and discards a non-character card. So a little bit different than Ursula. You can hit those songs. You can also hit those actions. You can hit those locations. You can hit those items. So Bare Necessities is great to deal with some of those big cards in a lot of different matchups, particularly Be Prepared. There's not really anything that's going to actively snipe Sisu out of your opponent's hand, which is why she is a card that's seeing so much play in the current meta. Next up, jumping over to the 3-cost slot, we are on 4 Aerial Spectacular Singer. This is actually our only 3-cost card in the deck, a 3-cost inkable 2/3 questing for 1 with Singer 5, which has kept her very relevant in the meta. She can sing those 5-cost songs, and her other ability keeps her quite relevant, especially for song-focused decks, and that is Musical Debut. When you play this character, you are going to look at the top 4 cards of your deck. If there's a song in them, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. Fantastic ability, especially if you grab something big for her to sing. Next up, jumping over to the 4-cost slot, we are on 3 The Muses, Proclaimers of Heroes. I do think she has potential for a 4 of. I ended up cutting down to 3 just because there were some other cards to play, but she is a 4-cost inkable 2/4 stat line questing for 1. She does have Ward. Ward is such a good ability because it's going to prevent her from just going off the board as soon as she hits the board. And when you play a song, you may return chosen character with 2 strength or less to their player's hand. Doesn't cost you anything extra. So if you're singing those songs with Muses, you are potentially getting rid of some of your opponent's cards or singing it with some of your other characters. Just keep bouncing them out, and then you can kind of out-tempo them in the mid-game. Muse is one of your great mid-game answers. Another great mid-game answer is going to be 4 Rapunzel, gifted with Healing, a 4-cost inkable 1/5 stat line questing for 2. As you can see, this deck doesn't have a ton of card draw. It's more focused on making your opponent discard, so being able to add in some card draw with something like Rapunzel is fantastic. She does also have that ability that's going to give you the card draw, is her ability Gleam and Glow. When you play this character, remove up to 3 damage from one of your characters, draw a card for each 1 damage removed this way. Still the most expensive non-enchanted, non-foil card in the game. I think the foils are pretty much up there with the foil Maleficent Dragon, so she may be one of the most expensive foils in the game as well. I'd have to look at the price for that. We can throw something on screen if I remember. If I don't, I'll put it in the description, so definitely check there. But Rapunzel, gifted with Healing, still an absolute staple in the meta. Then the 1 4-cost action we are playing, we are on 3 You're Welcome, a 4-cost inkable action song. Shuffle chosen character, item, or location into their player's deck. That player draws 2 cards, so kind of similar to the 6-cost Yzma we saw, and I think set 2 she came out. However, this one is going to let you target items and locations. You can also target your own items, locations, and characters if you feel so inclined to draw some additional cards if it's needed. But typically you're going to want to tempo your opponent with that, put something back into their deck, and then hopefully have Muses out to put something else back into their hand. Like I mentioned, we are on the Kita shift line with 4 5-cost inkable. Kita, Protector of Atlantis, a 3/5 stat line questing for 2, shifting for 3. We're not always looking to shift her, which is why we're only playing a couple of the shift targets for her. And when you play this character, all characters get -3 strength until the start of your next turn, including your characters, so always keep that in mind when you're throwing her down. Your characters are going to get that minus strength as well, so you may want to be prepared for that by going ahead and taking any challenges that you may need to take before Kita hits the board. But she's potentially going to keep your guys alive that following turn, back around till you can do some more stuff. Great target and song option when you do get those aerials is We Don't Talk About Bruno, coming in at the 5-cost slot, 5-cost inkable action song. Return chosen character to their player's hand, and that player discards a card at random, which is fantastic that it's at random because you never know what you're going to get rid of. You could get rid of a non-character card, you could bounce something simple back to their hand and end up making them discard a big Sisu, which is one of your biggest threats to this deck. So We Don't Talk About Bruno, fantastic. Jumping over to the 7-cost slot, and one of the last 2 cards in the deck, we are on 3 Clarabelle, Light on Her Hooves, a 7-cost inkable 5/6 stat line questing for 2, shifting for 5, so not super early. You may have to wait till turn 7 to really get her on the board. If you don't have that shift target, And at the end of your turn, if chosen opponent has more cards in their hand than you, you may draw cards until you have the same amount of cards in your hand. So like I mentioned, this deck isn't super card draw focused. So once you're running out of cards and your opponent is still outdrawing you, you can use Clarabelle to even the playing field. And the last card in the deck in the 8-drop slot is going to be 3 Under the Sea, an 8-cost uninkable action song. Sing Together aid, a mechanic we have not seen brought back. I would love to see in future sets. I think Sing Together is fantastic. I think it really made for some interesting cards and some interesting decks. But when you sing together this card or play it, however you may get it onto the field, you're going to put all opposing characters with 2 strength or less on the bottom of their players' decks in any order. So potentially if you are able to shift that Kita or play that Kita before singing this, you're going to be able to get rid of almost every single card that your opponent could possibly even have on the field, save for like the 2 kinds of Mauis and a couple other cards that are going to still have over 2 strength. But that is my breakdown on my Amber Emerald, kind of aggro-y mid-range thing that I have going on. It's a little bit weird. I can't really put this deck in a specific box. I guess I would say it's a little more mid-rangey because it does have a plan for the mid-range and the late game, but you can go heavy aggro with some of those early game cards and just aggro out your opponent before they're able to do anything about it, particularly into those Sapphire matchups. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on this deck in the comments below. Saw some really divisive comments about Fred in the past, so I'm super curious what your thoughts are on him. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have the time to do so, we always appreciate it. Helps the channel to grow and helps us to bring you more content and giveaways. So hopefully it's good for everybody. If you guys feel so inclined, I definitely appreciate it. And when you see those toys, video games, and Kita, Protector of Atlantis, making your opponent's guys much smaller off in the distance, remember, it is not a mirage. You guys have a great day.